gets back down to how do we make sure that the interest of liberty, freedom, the value systems that are common to humanity, what we think of as our, God-given creative rights, preserved in an era of technology such as ours, and those questions are not adequately being answered. In fact, we're being violated in ways that nobody ever contemplated a few hundred years ago, for sure.
Dr. Nick Begich is my guest, ladies and gentlemen. You're listening to the Vinnie Eastwood Show on American Freedom Radio. We're going to take a quick break now, and we'll be right back. Don't you touch that dial. And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to hour number 2 of the fastest 2 hours in talk radio. It's the Vinnie Eastwood Show. It's the lighter side of genocide, because in a world so full of chaos and madness, if you lose your sense of humour, you'll go friggin' nuts. And my very special guest is Dr. Nick Begich, coming at us from virtually the end of the world. And that happens to be the subject matter. Welcome back.
Hey, thanks for having me. Hey, it is. We were talking during the break about, where are we at the moment? And you're in New Zealand, I'm in Alaska. Kind of the opposite ends of the world. It is amazing, what you can do with technology. We're doing this radio show from literally for around the world, from around the world. I love it, and I'm like I was saying, I'm the second to last guy who still has internet before we hit an area the size of West Virginia that's empty, and you can look around from my place and see 10 kilometers and not see the sign or hear the sound of another living soul, which is kind of nice, when you think about it. The world has really got a lot of open place and open space still, at least in my part of the world, certainly, and much of the world that I've seen.
And people don't realize that if they're stuck in a city. And the city to rural ratio has really, really gone downhill. I mean, in terms of the amount of urbanization, we're talking about in the Great Depression of the 1930s, 10 million people in the United States starved to death. And that was during a time when 90% of people lived in rural areas and grew their own food. Today, right. 90% of people live in cities and do not grow their own food.
Right. And now we call that food organic produce. We used to call it food, right? When you think about that, just in terms of how we function, the world can still produce a tremendous amount. In fact, more than ever before per acre, we can produce tremendous amounts of food, and yet we tend to focus that in large commercialized farms now, not the small family farm of 100 years ago. But the idea of urban farming even is coming into vogue. Here in Alaska and Anchorage, they're actually starting one of these vertical farms indoors that have really high yields, high production because of all the things you can apply, in terms of growing systems. Think about that as it gets applied more and more around the world. Again, good application of technology, high density food growth.
A friend of mine, I was talking to at a party a number of years ago, and he was doing advanced robotics at a tech here in Auckland, and they had a growing rotating splint with an LED light supply above it. So you'd put your seedlings into the holes of the splint and have an automatic water feeding system. And right. The splint would then rotate with the LED light display in one direction up above them. And what they found was these seedlings would start growing towards the light, and because they're being rotated slowly, they grow up to 700% faster.
Yeah, in fact, when you start to apply the right frequency of light for specific plants, because just a slight change gets you higher yields as well. And then when you look at LEDs for low energy input, and when you start talking about that kind of productivity, and then you look at vertical farming, which again uses the full height of rooms and even the excess heat from lighting to keep rooms temperate for growing. But I think that's again where you start to think about, sort of the application of technology. We look at sort of how do we change all this in a way that might be even more productive and more useful. And when you start to think about technologies, the ones that we've had in the past have made us dependent. Think about us plugging into the grid, if you will. Things that used to be free, like television, now cost you money. I mean, when you think about the internet or any of your other connectivity, um,
I think
has
if you're going to think about dependence, think about people's dependence on their cell phones and how many numbers they can still remember.
right, right, and and if you're think about disconnecting in a way that allows you to still be connected, you want energy. Well, we should be self-sustaining in energy by now, and I think we can be. Even with what people acknowledge are the technologies on the planet today. The idea of hydrocarbon systems continuing to be propagated. And, when you think about what's going on in those markets right now and you talk about manipulation, oh my gosh,
Well, think
think
about
about,
the suppression of advanced fuel technology. Even the vaporizing carburetor that was getting like 200
yes,
miles per gallon and like what
right,
was it, the 40s, 50s, 60s, something like that, gets
right,
suppressed. And it turns out that the only reason why there's pollution of any kind coming out your tailpipe is because of unburned hydrocarbons. We're being made to use engines that are inefficient and give off waste.
right, right. And, when you think about all of that, you start thinking about, what are the real alternatives and how do you develop those and how do you incentivize that? And you got to change the whole business model from the one that says, how do you keep everybody coming back and being dependent to how do you reward creating independence where people can disconnect from some of these systems and be independent?
I,
Because in the 21st century, energy is a primary, it's like air, you got to have it, right?
It seems that there is a need for a new business model, and instead of having one bottom line, one business that I've heard of called Life Force International has three. So their production of their products has to be completely sustainable. You only take what you can and allow it to regrow. And the second part is it has to actually be really good for the customer. And the third bottom line is obviously just to make a profit.
Yeah. Yeah. And the idea of all that, and what does that generate? Profit generates an opportunity to do something again, right? And, in generally, if it's storing wealth, think about that. How much wealth is stored up that sort of stops the system from working? It really needs to be deployed. And I think that's where people confuse money with wealth. Wealth is entrepreneurship, labor, land and natural resources, and machinery that makes things. That's what true wealth is. Those are the factors of economic production. And currency is the medium that gets those things moving. And if you deploy those in ways that serve our interests better, I think that's then you have the opportunity for technology to serve us in a different way.
However, if you control the issuance of that currency, it means you can buy all of the real wealth.
Yeah, yeah, and you think about that in terms of what really happens on the planet and who consolidates it. And under the illusion of liberty, safety, security, freedom, whatever you want to wave your flag around. But ultimately, we've just traded different forms of slavery, in my estimation, because most of what we're capable of, whether it's our on the spiritual side or the emotional or physical side of life, are suppressed by fears, whether religion drives it, government drives it, or those who prefer to keep everything to themselves drives it, or greed, if you will. And not that, there's a whole philosophy even that, I forget, it's the Rand philosophy of greed is good, right? And, what does that mean? What are they really saying in that? I mean, what does that mean? I think it means that self-interest really does govern what happens on the planet, and maybe ultimately redefining what that might look like changes the planet and how our technologies are applied, how our natural resources are applied. You think about the wealth of natural resource, hydrocarbons alone. If you do them right, you can do them well. You don't have to blow it out the tailpipe, right? You can do this differently. And there's enough to go a very, very long time in terms of wealth of the world and hydrocarbons.
I saw an interesting study that was conducted where they got a whole bunch of students in, and their goal was to do this little map thing and engage in a mock trucking service. You know, your goal is to deliver the goods from point A to point B. However, between point A and point B, there are two different routes. One is really, really long and has no gates, and the other is really, really short but has two gates. And they did a number of different experiments between contestant A and contestant B to see who could make the most money and how. And they determined that it's only when both trucking companies operate a gate and allow both of themselves through and don't try to impinge on other people in terms of competition. Cooperation is more profitable than competition.
That's interesting. That's interesting. When you think about again, self-interest. If you can address everyone's interest in the course of putting the deal together, as some say, where everybody wins. I think you can. I think most things are resolvable. Most conflict is. If it's transparent, open dialogue, you can get to rational finish lines in most cases. When you think about so much of what drives bad outcomes is what's hidden from us. If we actually knew what was happening within our governments, within our economies, if we really thought about it,
there'd be a revolution before morning.
It would be so much. People would be amazed. They would be grinding their teeth, for sure. But again, maybe that day will come. I hope it does.
Are there two? I've defined two specific reactions to this, like figuring out the way the world works. One is a close-off reaction. I don't want to hear about it. I don't want to do it. Basically, it's a fear reaction. And the other one is more or less the opposite of a fear reaction, which is an anger reaction, which is often... what was it? I heard a great quote sometime in my life. It said that anger is preferable to depression because you get a lot more done.
I think it's maybe that's true, but maybe it's a little reckless, because maybe it just feeds the beast. That's the root of the problem, because a lot of anger drives a lot of it. Fear drives a lot of it ultimately, too. Because these guys, once they have a lot of things and want to keep it, it's fear, too. But when you think about that whole mindset, what does anger eventually shift to? It eventually shifts to some sort of reconciliation and then some affirmative action. And maybe there's the secret of it. When you think about anger or any emotion, once you recognize it, sort of you see it or you notice it, it no longer takes you, but you take it. And then maybe you channel that energy into something more constructive rather than destructive,
Well, I think a lot of our emotional reactions exist for a reason, and sometimes blocking them out isn't the best thing. Sometimes the best thing is finding the reason.
Right. And, I think you experience it, observe it, and then do something with it that changes the game. Because righteous anger is a rare thing. Usually anger is more, based on inconvenience. It's selfish anger, actually. Righteous anger is rare, but when it's there, it's time to convert some energy into making some changes.
Well, there's power in it, and of course, if, like all power, if misused, it can be dangerous and deadly. Speaking of which, a recent study has confirmed that the majority of car accidents are caused by anger, psychotropic drugs, and people who are sleep deprived. And this study also included people who were smoking cannabis while driving, and they don't cause accidents at all. And that's probably because they're not angry.
Anger, when you think about it, if you look at an EEG, the brain activity when people are experiencing anger or depression or any of those negative emotions, what you get is incoherent brain patterns, not rhythmic at all. They're kind of all over the map. and they're the ones associated with flight or fight responses, and they're not associated with higher ordered thinking or intellectual thinking. When you see those ordered rhythmic patterns that are associated with that higher ordered thinking, it tends to be slower, more rhythmic.
Because in a world so full of chaos and madness, if you lose your sense of humour, you'll go friggin' nuts. And my very special guest is Dr. Nick Begich, coming at us from virtually the end of the world. And that happens to be the subject matter. Welcome back.
Hey, thanks for having me. Hey, it is, we were talking during the break about, where are we at the moment? And you're in New Zealand, I'm in Alaska, kind of the opposite ends of the world. It is amazing, what you can do with technology. We're doing this radio show from literally for around the world from technology such as ours. And those questions are not adequately being answered. In fact, we're being violated in ways that nobody ever contemplated a few hundred years ago, for sure.
Dr. Nick Begich is my guest, ladies and gentlemen.
It's back down to how do we make sure that the interest of liberty, freedom, the value systems that are common to humanity, what we think of as our, God-given creative rights, preserved in an era of tech.
And you're listening to the Vinnie Eastwood Show on American Freedom Radio. We're going to take a quick break now, and we'll be right back. Don't you touch that dial. And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to hour number 2 of the fastest 2 hours in talk radio. It's the Vinnie Eastwood Show. It's the lighter side of genocide.